I turned. The gates of the estate opened before me, but inside there was no feeling of home. I had grown up here, but I had always known this house was not for me. This was my brother's world, a world where I had always been superfluous. A strong gust of wind tore a few yellowed leaves from the trees and whirled them in the air. Autumn was in full swing, and the cold was piercing to the bone. I shoved my hands deeper into the pockets of my coat and took a step onto the gravel path that led to the huge doors. There was silence inside, but not calm, but tense, as if everyone was waiting for something inevitable. The living room was crowded. Relatives, my father's friends, employees of the company. Everyone whispered among themselves, but the main attention was focused on one person. Andrew. My brother stood in the center of the room, confidently shaking hands with the guests, accepting condolences and praise as if it were his day, as if he were the hero of the story. He was a wonderful leader, one of my father's business partners was saying. But I know you, Andrew, will carry on his work with dignity. I moved closer. The strange faces that were looking at me with curiosity did not bother me. The only one who interested me now was my brother. He turned to me, his lips stretching into a familiar, impudent smile. "Katerina," he drawled, as if my arrival had been a surprise. "I'm glad to see you found the time after all." "You know I was supposed to come," I replied calmly. He cocked his head to the side, assessing me. "Well, since you're here, I think you'll be interested to hear how the inheritance was divided." I kept my expression neutral, though inside I was tense with anticipation. "Yes," I nodded. "That's really interesting." I took a seat at the large table in the library. They only came here when they had important decisions to make. The lawyer opened a folder of documents. I was ready, or so I thought. The library was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. The lawyer, an elderly man with graying temples and a piercing gaze, slowly turned the first page of the documents. I sat with my back straight, showing no emotion, although everything was boiling inside me. It seemed that everyone in this room already knew what was going to happen except me. "Mr. Douglas's will," the lawyer began in a calm voice, "distributes his assets as follows." I held my breath. "The entire family business, real estate, financial assets, and securities are transferred to the full control of Andrew Douglas." Silence. I did not immediately understand what I heard. I could not. My mind simply refused to accept this information. "What?" My voice was too quiet. The lawyer did not even look up. He turned the page and continued, "Catherine Douglas gets no share of the inheritance." My heart pounded in my chest. I felt cold fingers gripping the arms of the chair. "Why?" My words came out muffled, as if from another world. "Your father thought you were a strong and independent woman who could take care of herself." The lawyer finally looked at me, but there was only sympathy in his eyes. I gritted my teeth, looking away. "That's not fair." I couldn't stand it, and it was at that moment that I heard his laugh. Deep, smug, quiet but expressive. I looked over at my brother. Andrew was sitting in the chair across from me, barely suppressing a smile. "Well, sister," his voice was laced with mockery, "that makes sense, doesn't it? I've always been the better one." I felt the blood rush to my face. They thought I wouldn't do anything. They were wrong. I left the library, trying to keep my back straight and my steps steady. But inside I was seething. Anger, resentment, a sense of betrayal. I headed for the living room, avoiding the surprised looks of the guests. The air was thick with whispers. Everyone already knew. Everyone had always known that this would happen except me. Mom came closer. Her face was impassive, but something akin to regret flickered in her eyes. "Katerina, you understand that your father simply wanted you to build your own life." She spoke softly as usual. I took a deeper breath. "On your own," I repeated. "Is that what he said?" She nodded slightly. "He always knew you were strong." I exhaled and tried to suppress an ironic laugh. "And Andrew, so he's weak? Does he need a house, a business, money?" Mom pursed her lips as if I had said something obscene. "Don't say that. Dad just believed in you." I nodded. "Yes, I understand. He believed in me enough to leave me with nothing." Mom opened her mouth to say something, but I had already turned and left. I didn't want to hear any more of their excuses. I went up to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. It was a blow. But not a knockout. I hadn't lost. I hadn't started playing yet. I knew Andrew hadn't just gotten everything. Dad couldn't have ignored me like that, because I was a part of him too. If the will was real, I would find a way to challenge it. And if it was fake, I destroyed Andrew. I got up and opened my father's old desk. I needed the documents. I needed the truth. I spent the next few hours digging through old documents. The same wooden desk I had used to do my homework at still stood in my room. I opened drawer after drawer, going through papers, trying to find anything that might help. My father was too smart to leave everything in Andrew's hands without at least some insurance. I read his old notes, the company's financial statements, his personal letters. And finally I found something that made me hold my breath. If anything happens, contact Mr. Clark. I read this note several times. Mr. Clark had been a longtime friend of our family, but after Andrew became the head of the business, he had suddenly faded into the shadows. I took out my phone and quickly found his number. "Hello," came the old, slightly hoarse voice. "Mr. Clark, this is Catherine Douglas." A few seconds of silence. "Catherine, I knew you would call." My fingers tightened on the phone. "Did you know?" "Yes. Your father didn't trust Andrew as much as everyone thought." My heart beat faster. "Did he leave something for me?" "We need to meet." "But not on the phone." I closed my eyes, trying to hide my excitement. "Okay, I'll come." I ended the call and felt the first spark of hope ignite inside me. But besides that, I needed one more thing: Andrew's weaknesses. I took out my laptop and started digging. My brother loved the luxurious life. I knew he spent large sums of money on parties, cars, and travel. But how far had it gone? I entered his name into a database of financial companies that I had access to through my connections. And I came across something interesting. Large loans, opened just a few months ago. Numerous payments to unknown recipients. He was not just a spendthrift. He was up to his ears in debt. I smiled. I was beginning to see the picture. My brother needed money for more than just living. He was desperately trying to stay afloat. If the will turned out to be a forgery and his debt surfaced, he would lose everything. And that would only be the beginning. The next morning I arrived at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Mr. Clark was already waiting for me at a table in the corner, holding a cup of black coffee. His eyes were tired but attentive. "Catherine," he nodded as I sat down opposite him. "You said my father didn't trust Andrew." I got straight to the point. "What did you mean?" He sighed and pulled out a few documents from a folder. "These are copies of one of your father's early wills. It was supposed to be up to date, until another one suddenly appeared, the one read by the lawyer." I took the papers and began to read. 50% of the business goes to Catherine Douglas, 50% to Andrew Douglas. The real estate and financial assets are divided equally. My heart was pounding in my chest. Is this the will that was supposed to be valid?" Mr. Clark nodded. "But a few months before his death, your father supposedly wrote a new one. Without any warning. Do you suspect it was forged?" He paused before answering. "I can't say for sure, but I know that before he died, he told me that he wanted to provide for you because he knew Andrew wouldn't be able to do it on his own." I studied the will. "What if I find evidence of forgery?" Clark smiled. "Then you can challenge him in court." I leaned back in my chair. I needed to find real evidence, something that could shatter the case. I picked up the papers and started to leave, but Clark stopped me with a look. "There's one more thing, Katerina." I raised my eyebrows. "What exactly?" "I suspect that Andrew didn't just forge the will. He could have bribed the lawyer who read it." I froze. This was even more serious than I thought. If I can prove it, my brother won't just lose everything. He could go to jail. I left the cafe, wrapping my coat more tightly around him. 1,000 thoughts were racing through my head. I had the trump card. All that remained was to play it right. I returned home with a clear plan of action. First of all, I needed to make sure that Andrew didn't suspect that I was up to something. He was too self-confident, and I could take advantage of that. I found him in the living room, where he was comfortably settled in an armchair with a glass of expensive whiskey. "Katerina," he drew out his words, as if he were talking to a stupid child. "How are you holding up? I hope you're not too upset about the will." I forced myself to smile. Well, Dad made his decision the way he made it. I can't change the past. Andrew squinted, trying to understand if this was a trap. That's the right attitude, sister. He nodded, satisfied, and leaned back in his chair. I paused, then added, by the way, I was thinking maybe we should celebrate. You're the rightful owner of everything now. His eyebrows rose in surprise. Celebrate? Why not? We'll throw a dinner party for friends, partners. We'll show off your status. Andrew thought for a moment, then smiled slyly. That sounds good. Let's do it. I knew he wouldn't refuse. He'd always loved attention. And I knew this dinner party would be his first big mistake. Step 1, the legal strike. That same night, I filed a lawsuit to challenge the will. I acted quickly and carefully so that the information didn't reach my brother. My lawyers began reviewing the documents, and Mr. Clark was busy searching for evidence of forgery. But that was only the beginning. Step 2, the financial strike. I knew my brother was in debt, and this was another weapon I had. I began sending anonymous letters to his creditors, implying that his financial stability was an illusion. As I had predicted, his phone soon began to ring. I watched him from afar as he got angry, shouting into the phone. I told you, everything will be fine. Just give me a little more time. He was nervous. That was good, but the best was yet to come. He didn't know that the real blow awaited him. The next few days were chaotic for Andrew. His usually confident demeanor began to change. Dark circles under his eyes, nervous movements, constant phone conversations. I passed him in the living room as he was arguing heatedly with someone again. Look, I told you this was a temporary hardship. I have money. I smiled, not stopping. After my anonymous messages, his creditors began to press. His accounts were almost empty, and I knew he was spending money faster than he was earning. But that was only the beginning. Step 3, undermining trust. I contacted several partners in our family business, those who still remembered and respected my father. I hinted to them that information about Andrew's financial machinations might soon surface. The result was not long in coming. Catherine, you were right, said one of the partners, Mr. Lawrence. Some are beginning to doubt your brother's competence. If he really can't run the company. I pretended to hesitate. I don't want to put him in the position, but if things get out of hand, I'll have to act. We're counting on you, he replied. I knew that just a little more time would be enough for Andrew's support to collapse like a house of cards. Step 4, the brother's suspicion. The next evening, as I was reviewing new documents in my office, the door suddenly opened. Andrew was standing in the hallway. Is that you? His voice was tense. I raised my eyebrows. What are you talking about? Don't play with me. He took a step forward, his eyes blazing with fury. All these problems, are they your doing? I sighed and crossed my arms. Andrew, if you have problems, maybe you should look within yourself. His fists clenched. You couldn't just accept it, could you? I slowly stood up. You took everything from me, but I'm still here, and you don't know what I'm capable of. I walked past him, lightly touching his shoulder. He was silent, but I knew fear was boiling inside him, and that could only mean one thing. I was on the right track. Andrew was starting to get nervous. He no longer looked like the confident heir he had been when the will was announced. I could see him constantly checking his phone, reacting sharply to every call. But the real blow was yet to come. Step 5, exposing the fraud. I met with my lawyers. We've checked the documents, one of them said, unfolding the papers. There are significant discrepancies between your father's signatures on the old documents and what's on the last will. So it's a forgery? Very likely. We can officially request an expert opinion. If the results confirm our suspicions, the will be declared invalid. I smiled. Submit an opinion. This was the final nail in Andrew's coffin. Step 6, debts are pressing. The creditors didn't want to wait any longer. The day I received official confirmation of the fraud case, the bankers showed up at the house. I stood on the steps and watched Andrew talk to them in a confused manner. You have to understand, his voice trembled. I will pay everything. Just give me a little more time. Your assets are frozen, Mr. Douglas, one of the bankers replied coldly. I could barely contain my smile. His illusion of control was crumbling before his eyes. Step 7, the breaking news. But I saved the best for last. I met with the reporters, handing them the documents about the will fraud and Andrew's financial machinations. The next morning, the headlines were, Andrew Douglas, heir or conman? I was sitting at breakfast when he burst into the kitchen. It's you, he shouted, throwing the newspaper on the table. I slowly looked up. What are you talking about? You ruined me. I picked up my cup of coffee and took a sip. No, Andrew. I looked him straight in the eye. You did it yourself. His chest heaved with anger, but there was nothing he could do. I had won, and he knew it. Andrew still had the newspaper in his hands, but his fingers were shaking. His eyes were flashing, his lips twitching with tension. You just couldn't accept it, could you? His voice was hoarse, almost broken. I calmly set the cup down on the table and folded my arms across my chest. You took everything from me, I said evenly. But you made one mistake. His eyes narrowed. What? I leaned forward a little and replied quietly, I'm not the type to give up. His face twisted in rage. He turned abruptly and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door so hard that the clanking of dishes filled the silence. It was the first time he'd realized he was losing. Step 8. The trial. A week later, the court hearing was held. My lawyers presented evidence. A signature examination confirmed that the will Andrew relied on was a forgery. Based on the evidence before us, the court declares this document invalid. The judge announced, banging his gavel. I was sitting in the front row and saw Andrew's head hang. Mr. Douglas's original will be restored, and his assets will be redistributed according to his original instructions. That meant only one thing. I had everything back that was mine. Andrew stood up silently, his shoulders hunched, as if all his mistakes had fallen on him. I felt relieved, but I wasn't done yet. The court ruling was just the beginning of the end for Andrew. Now that his father's will had been restored, everything he had considered his had gone to me. The house, the business, the money, but the worst was yet to come. His debts. Without ownership of the assets, he could no longer use the company as a source of money to cover his financial holes. The banks and creditors who had trusted him until recently now demanded immediate repayment. I received a message from one of our father's former partners. Katerina, we no longer trust your brother. If you take over the company, we will work with you. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Andrew, who had thought himself indispensable all his life, was now redundant. His final downfall. He came home late that evening. His suit was wrinkled, his face haggard. I was waiting for him in the living room. What do you need? He muttered, pausing in the doorway. I just wanted to see you. I folded my arms, smiling slightly. You took everything. His voice was broken. The house, the company, the reputation. No, Andrew. I stood up slowly. I just took back what was mine. He shrugged, running his hands nervously through his hair. What do I do now? I moved closer, looking him straight in the eye. It's not my problem. Andrew pursed his lips. You have no idea how much I hate you. I smiled. Get used to it. He turned sharply and walked away. I watched him go. This was his final defeat. But I didn't care. I won. And no one can stop me anymore. The next morning I officially took over. My father's large oak office, which had been the heart of the company for years, now belonged to me. I sat at his desk, looking at the old photos on the wall, times when he had run the business with confidence and uncompromising determination. It was now my responsibility. The transfer documents lay before me. The lawyers had already taken care of all the formalities. I signed the last page. Now everything officially belonged to me. Andrew's fate. A few hours later, I learned that my brother had tried to negotiate with his creditors, but to no avail. His debts were too great, and now that he had lost access to the family assets, no one wanted to help him. My mother tried to intervene, but her influence was minimal. Andrew was left alone. No money, no business, no future. And as I had predicted, he was soon forced to sell his car and then move. I knew he was now living in a rented apartment in a not-so-great part of town. I should have felt sorry for him, but I felt nothing. He got what he deserved. As time passed, Andrew became increasingly desperate. His phone calls to influential acquaintances went unanswered. Former friends turned away from him, partners avoided meetings. He was no longer the heir to a great dynasty. Now he was simply a loser who had lost everything. One day I received a message from our mother. Katerina, please talk to your brother. He is in a terrible state. I read it, but did not respond. I knew what would happen next. The meeting he did not want. A few days later, I found him at the entrance to our former family estate. He was standing at the gate in a wrinkled jacket, with dark circles under his eyes. "What are you doing here?" I asked coldly, stopping in front of him. He looked up at me with a devastated look. I just wanted to talk." His voice was low, broken. I crossed my arms. "You have exactly 5 minutes." He took a deep breath, as if preparing to say something important. "I screwed up," he finally admitted. "I made terrible mistakes." I remained silent. "You won, Kate." His voice trembled. "You were always smarter, and I never admitted it." I looked at him closely. "Is that what you wanted to tell me?" He shook his head. "I want to know, can we fix this?" I took a deep breath. "No, Andrew. We can't." He clenched his fists as if he'd expected it, but he still wasn't ready to hear it. "Please," he whispered. "We're family." I looked him straight in the eye. "Family?" I barely held back a bitter smile. "You betrayed me. You took everything that belonged to me. And now that you're feeling bad, you want me to forgive you for everything?" His lips twitched. "I thought you just wouldn't do anything." I took a pause, then took a step forward and whispered back. "You thought wrong." After that, I turned around and closed the gate in his face. I never saw him again. After that meeting, I didn't think about Andrew anymore. He had ruined his own life, and it was no longer my problem. The estate was now completely under my control. I walked through its corridors, feeling the atmosphere change. Once I had felt alien here, unnecessary, as if this house was made just for my brother. Now everything was different. This was my home. I walked into the office where my father had once worked and took a seat at his desk. I was no longer the girl who could be simply pushed aside. I was the one in charge. Andrew, the latest news. A few weeks later, I learned that my brother had left town. He couldn't stay here any longer. Everyone knew he was a con man, a fraud, and a loser. The latest rumors were that he was working in some minor job, trying to survive somehow. He had everything once, and now he had nothing. And I didn't even feel sorry for him. My new life. I was no longer the Katerina everyone considered superfluous. I became the owner of the family business, the estate, the capital. I became the one who runs the game. And now no one would dare to underestimate me anymore. I looked out the window, enjoying the view of the city that now belonged to me. This was my victory. It took me just a few months to turn the company from a shaky asset into a thriving enterprise. I got rid of all the questionable partners that Andrew had brought in and brought back my father's old team, those who really understood how the business worked. The results were immediate. Profits began to grow, and the trust of clients and partners returned. I worked day and night to prove to everyone, and to myself, first and foremost, that I was more than just an heiress. I was the mistress of this business, and now everything was working as it should have from the very beginning. Life without Andrew. My mother tried to talk about her brother several more times. "Maybe you can at least help him find a job," she said one day at a family dinner. I put down my glass of wine and looked her straight in the eyes. "He made his choice, Mom." She sighed, but didn't bring up the subject again. I knew Andrew would never be able to return to this world. His name was tarnished, his reputation destroyed. But it was his own fault, and I wasn't going to drag him out of the quagmire he'd gotten himself into. Almost a year had passed. My business was booming. Things were going better than ever. I had done something my father probably never imagined. Not just kept the company going, but took it to the next level. And then one evening my mother called me. "Katerina, he's back!" Her voice was quiet, as if she was afraid of my reaction. I knew immediately who she was talking about. "And what do you want from me?" She sighed. "Just meet him. He's completely broken." I was silent for a moment, then said, "Okay, but this will be the last time we talk." A meeting I didn't expect. The next day I arrived at the old cafe where my brother and I used to gather as children. Andrew was sitting in the far corner, staring into a cup of coffee. He had changed a lot. He had lost weight. His hair was carelessly cut. There were dark circles under his eyes. I sat down opposite him. He looked up at me. "Hi, Kate." I didn't say anything. I was just waiting. "I know I don't have the right to ask you anymore," he swallowed, as if each word was given to him with pain. But I can't live like this anymore. I raised my eyebrows. You made your own choice. He nervously clenched his fingers. I was an idiot. I lost everything because of my pride. I looked at him silently. Give me a chance, Kate. Any job, anything. His voice was hoarse. He no longer looked like the cocky brother who had laughed in my face the day the will was announced. Now I sat in front of me, a broken man. I took a deep breath and leaned back in my chair. Last chance, Andrew. But you won't be the one to choose the terms. He grabbed the opportunity, as if it were the last straw. But I didn't know yet if he had really changed. I gave him a chance, but on my terms. I wasn't going to give him any important positions or give him access to the company's management. You'll start at the bottom, I said coldly when we met in my office the next day. If you've really changed, prove it. He nodded without arguing. I put him in one of the lowest positions in the company, a regular financial analyst in a department with no direct influence on major decisions. This was his test. Had he changed? At first, he worked hard. I even thought that maybe this blow had really changed him. But after a few months, I began to notice familiar signs. First, minor delays. Then, excuses, saying he deserved more. And then one day, I was told that he had tried to make a deal with one of my partners behind my back. That was the last straw. I called him into my office. You didn't understand, did you? I said, looking him straight in the eye. Andrew was silent, his head down. I gave you a chance, and you blew it again. I took the pen and signed the document in front of me. You're fired. Forever. He raised his head sharply. Kate, please. I shook my head. No more chances. This time I saw real panic in his eyes. But I didn't care. I wasn't giving him another chance to destroy what I'd worked so hard to rebuild. He stood up, paused for a moment, as if to say something, but then he just walked away. And this time I knew it was forever. The end of the game. I was sitting back in my father's office, which was now mine. I remembered everything I had been through, the injustice, the struggle, the revenge. I was no longer that naive girl who believed in honesty and justice. I had learned to take what was mine. I had won, and no one would ever make me doubt who I was again. I was the one who had given it all back, and now it was all mine.